Good evening. I've got too many things to carry. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome to the Heiliggeistkapelle as part of the Faculty of Economics at Humboldt University. Welcome for making it out tonight. Thank you. And welcome to tonight's Cosmos lecture, Climate and Cohesion Notes from a Global Observatory. I'd like to, first of all, thanks everyone for the invitation. Thanks, Anne, for organizing all of this so that we can be here and getting this all done. Thanks for the crew from Division 8 at Humboldt University, the public relations people that brought people in here I haven't seen before, so it's nice to have some interaction with people who don't know what we're going to say, what I'm going to say. So yeah, welcome. My name is Jörg Niewöhner. I'm an anthropologist and environmental scientist and based at the IRI THESys, which is Humboldt University's Integrative Research Institute for the study of transformations of human environment systems. When we are not busy celebrating our 10-year anniversary, like we are doing today and tomorrow, we are studying the effects of rapid planetary change on people, on land, on water and ecosystems, as well as infrastructures and institutions across the globe to understand and contribute to transformations towards sustainability and long-term planetary habitability. Last autumn, though, many of us at the Institute were startled by this headline in the German press. Apparently, we were heading for a different kind of societal transformation. The perfect storm seemed to be brewing. On the back of the COVID pandemic, which left many in Germany financially, economically and emotionally vulnerable, the Russian war on Ukraine led to a sharp increase in energy costs, which in turn pushed inflation to levels unheard of in Western Europe for a long time. Policy measures aimed at saving energy stood in somewhat uncanny resonance with the controversial corona measures that we had just about left behind. Intelligence seemed to suggest that particularly in structurally vulnerable regions such as rural eastern Germany, civil unrest might be imminent. The worry was that very real economic and emotional pressures on people and businesses and associated dissatisfaction with past and current government policies would be politically captured by the new right to make people take to the streets and to incite violence against those in power, against perceived outsiders, be they refugees, migrants or leftist urbanites. An explosive mixture of structural inequality and a strong sense of frustration and disempowerment would combine with the acute pressure of multiple economic, military and social crises. We were alarmed. We were alarmed in two ways. First, this warning was a very real cause for concern in a very immediate sense. What was going to happen? Could we do anything about it? Second, however, we worried what this situation would mean for the acute planetary ecological crises set off by rapid climate change. At IRI THESys, we have been doing everything we can to contribute to a transformation of our ways of living and working in order to reduce our footprint and metabolism to minimize the global harm caused by climate change. And while things could have gone faster and with greater sense of direction, mitigation against climate change has made it onto the political agenda and into public discourse, and things started to happen. Now the question was, how will our efforts to respond to climate change fare against a new set of priorities? Inflation, war, civil unrest. How will we address this multitude of crises, emergencies, and existential threats? To better understand this worrisome conjuncture, we set up the IRI THESys Global Observatory. Using our very international membership in the Institute, we set up a loosely connected network of observers spread across the globe. Our code name, Winter of Discontent. After the winter of 1978 and 79, which paralyzed the UK through major strike action, and at the end of which Margaret Thatcher, whom some of you may remember, became Prime Minister after winning the 1979 general election. A paradigmatic political shift which disempowered the political left and helped to usher in an era of neoliberal reforms across Europe and worldwide, reforms, in fact, that are at the root of what we are dealing with today. The observatory has monitored public discourses, policy developments, significant events and personal experiences. Rather than setting up a rigid and standardized observational lens, we asked all members of the observatory to collect and start to interpret what they consider significant shifts, events, political or infrastructural development all over the world. So this is not a systematic study, but an entry point for an important discussion which tonight we would like to have with you. Now, many of you, particularly when you spent the winter in Germany, will have realized that the winter of discontent turned out somewhat differently from what intelligence expected. Yes, the Russian war tragically continued and continues to the day. Inflation and energy prices did rise as expected and feared. We might even have a slide with lines going up. Yet Germany did not disintegrate. The streets were not overrun with protesters. Violence did not overturn social order. No major demonstration, no rioting, no looting. How come? What happened? Well, first of all, it might be that the Federal Intelligence Agency got it wrong altogether. I know, it might seem unfathomable, but intelligence is not always what its name suggests, and predictions are always difficult, particularly predictions about the future, of course. So maybe people are able and willing to handle this extra burden and are busy with their everyday lives rather than leaning towards civil unrest. Second, Shakespeare was closer to the truth than the Federal Intelligence Agency or the British media in the 1970s. The phrase winter of discontent, which of course you as an educated audience know, originates from Shakespeare's play Richard III. In perhaps the theatre's most famous opening monologue, Richard, not king yet, but Duke of Gloucester and brother to the King Edward IV, enters the stage, so imagine a street in London, and begins. So it's now Laurence Olivier, I mean. Of course he says, now is the winter of discontent, but he also says, now is the winter of discontent made glorious by this son of York, is what he says. So what he's essentially saying is, so times were difficult, never mind the details of this now, but have been turned around by the son of York. Now this could not be closer to the truth in our German winter of discontent that started so worrisome. The son of York was, for us, first of all, a very mild winter. There we go. Second, and perfectly in line with Shakespeare's mildly funny pun, we also had our son of York. And there he is, and that's 400,000 euros well spent in the press department, may I say. Sorry. So just like King Edward won the battle for the crown and turned a winter of discontent into glorious summer, so did our son of York, Robert Habeck, travel the globe to win the battle for us here in Germany. Let me pick out the three most poignant of those victories. The first one, here he is in Doha buying gas of the Emir of Qatar, Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. Here he is looking already like Laurence Olivier, getting LNG terminals done in the Baltic Sea and on the way causing a little aggravation amongst locals who thought tourism might be better than LNG terminals, but never mind that. And thirdly, of course, he's been on tour in Latin America, and here we see kinds of projects that this shopping tour helps to promote in Colombia and in Chile. So the winter of discontent was turned into a glorious summer in which we did not really have to adjust our lifestyle at all. Wonderful. Now, what about climate protection? What about mitigation and adaptation? Well, our son of York is a member of the Green Party, so he's making sure that our energy needs are met without compromising others' needs, including the environment. You can, it turns out, have the cake and eat it too. In spring this year, we even relaxed the German climate protection law, enabling cross-sector compensation and abandoning external expert evaluation. If it needed a signal to say, things are under control, keep calm and carry on, there it was. We are doing so well that we slow down political measures on climate action. So thanks to a quick and decisive political response, we survived a difficult winter and learned three key lessons about how to handle complex crises. First, we as individuals are resilient, creative, and find ways to cope. Hence, it is important that in times of crisis, we focus on improving individuals' abilities to act. Second, Germany is a nation with sufficient economic power to secure its own resource supply globally if necessary. we can handle crises at national level. And third, Germany and Western Europe are the places that develop the technological and social innovations that make everyone more resilient in the face of global and planetary changes. So let me elaborate. First, the role of the individual.
Jörg, can I stop you here for a second?
Well,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, if you have to.
Yeah. Jörg, it's great that you're being so positive about this, but maybe you're not quite getting the full picture of what coping actually means. And who is the we you are talking about? My colleagues and I have been running the logbook throughout the pandemic and into the war. This functions as an online diary for German-speaking people across the country to document changes in daily life. And not few document concerns of their chest. It is showing a very different and much more diverse picture of the many, many ways in which people can, want, must, or cannot maintain daily life in times of crisis. So look, Jörg, on only one day, October 16th, 3 different logbook writers' documentations show that your picture does not quite cover all aspects of individual and societal capabilities for resilience and creativity in times of multiple crises. Overall, Corona and the war were like a magnifying glass. People relinquished control mechanisms more often, reacted emotionally, and thus revealed a lot about themselves. As a high-risk patient, self-protection was essential in the early stages of the pandemic. The loss of values and its effects became abundantly clear. Strong withdrawal tendencies are still visible in parts of society. This reinforces the already increasing isolation. Pandemic and war hit a strongly individualized society, which in large parts still clings to the status quo. The gap between rich and poor, old and young, has widened considerably. In parts of society, there is a state of war. Next slide, please. The situation of our elderly family members has deteriorated greatly. Doctor visits, hospital care, etc. They suffered the most from the pandemic due to contact restrictions and limitation of mobility. The war has activated all traumas and greatly accelerated the aging process. Due to a long COVID illness, I lost my job and fell into a gap in the social system. My injury benefit has expired, but my reduced earning capacity pension has not yet been approved. In the meantime, I have now registered as unemployed and deliberately concealed my illness and inability to work in order to be financially secure, at least for a while. And Jörg, individuals' resilience is based on different resources, and while learning from one crisis can be beneficial for the next, our preference and also need for quick fixes in acute situations does not address the long-term nature of climate crisis. See what the logbook writers documented over Christmas time. I still haven't received my widow's pension from my husband who died in 2020. I can still afford it, but my employment contract expires in September 23rd, and I am 57. In my telephone conversations with acquaintances, I always hear, "The war should finally stop. Doesn't humanity learn anything from the past? And we are concerned about climate change. Such a warm January with daytime temperatures around 14 degrees is completely crazy." Our boiler needs to be replaced. The faults, especially with the clock control, are increasing all the time. It's good that the necessary money is there, and the boiler can also be delivered. Our neighbors are less fortunate. There were delays with their solar system and heat pump. There are still parts missing, and that are supposed to come from China and Austria. The installation of the solar panels took 8 weeks instead of 4. We now have an emergency stockpile, triggered by who knows when we'll have to go into quarantine. That's a really cool feeling. It also beats the energy crisis.
Well, okay, Bettina, I take your point. That is some interesting data, adding an important perspective. Some individuals, I take it, might be particularly vulnerable. Oh, this carries on now, does it?
Yes,
okay,
please.
sorry.
I would like to interrupt you, too, because I think before you say that we are doing well, I have more data to comment here. So, well, I would like to continue where Bettina left off and talk about some experiences of crisis that people are having, or what you call interesting data. I also want to add to Bettina a question about who is the we you are talking about, particularly what coping with high heating prices means for immigrant women coming to Berlin from different climates. We don't just come from different climates. We also come from different housing constructions, different bureaucracy systems, different languages, different cultures. So these are the stories from an internet platform where migrant women in Berlin communicate all kinds of information to help each other in different areas of their lives about what they don't understand about everyday life in Germany. Here. So in mid-October, close to your first quote, Bettina, when temperatures start to drop, the fear of the rising heating prices became more and more present. A woman writes on the forum, "Woman in Berlin, how are you planning to survive this winter? Winter hasn't gotten any easier for me after 6 years, but this year with the energy crisis is especially daunting. My company has just informed us that they are turning the central heating to 19 degrees. That's too cold for me 8 hours a day, coming from a warm climate. My feet are cold just reading this email." By November, about 5 or 4 times a week, someone's opened the topic again in this forum. By the beginning of November, someone wrote, "Honest question, because I'm freaking out about the heating cost. Can you live through the winter in Berlin without turning on the heating? I have a wearable blanket, thermal underwear, and a hot water bottle." What follows each questions are answers from different experiences, fears, strategies for coping with the cold, conversation about heating pads, fluffy blankets, fluffy socks, wearing hats inside the home, curtains, this DIY heater with the bricks and the candles, using aluminum foil behind the radiator, bubble wrap over the window, bathing with a bucket, living in an altbau, living in an underground flat, and mold. That mold threat issue. We always end up talking about mold. What are the obligations of renting a flat in Berlin? Do I have to ventilate every day? How many times? Do I have to maintain a minimum temperature of 15 degrees, 13 degrees, 18 degrees? Because otherwise it gets moldy. It's true that the pipes freeze if I don't turn the heating on. Landlords ask to leave the heating on close to 18 degrees to prevent mold. What does our rental contract says? We don't understand. So now, Jörg, you might say, what's particular about immigrants? Everyone did that. Here's the difference. The difference is in the fear of losing the tenancy for people who have to move out from one WG to another 5 times in a year. The fear of not having that damned Anmeldung. The fear of losing the visa. The fear of have to leave the country because of the mold. That is a fear that you don't have, and other German citizens do not have. And the issue is genders, as women are often taking care of others. One woman mentioned that she only turned on the heater because she has 2 small children and a baby. Another one told us that she's tried not to turn on the heater, but her daughter was sick. Even the care of cats and plants, as you can see in the quotes, is mentioned as a reason for turning on the heating. Care work is another issue that you and many others do not think about. Then there is a gender pay gap that you don't think about. This last long quote says, "Just before Christmas, I received a notice from my Hausverwaltung that our heating costs and other Nebenkosten altogether will raise 300% starting from January. I work full-time. I really earn just a bit over the minimum wage and just make the ends meet somehow. The news really freaked me out. I'm just panicking. I'm angry that I'm freaking study and work for years, speak several languages, and still all I can do is just survive in life. Of course, there are other voices. Some people say having grown up with parents from the third world, water and energy conservation was drilled into me from a young age. And myself, I'm working in Chile and how people cope with cold houses. In winter, having 19 degrees in Chile is a luxury for a large part of the Chilean population. But my point is this: the crises that occur at a global and national scales are interdependent with one of the basic elements of people's daily concerns. However, crises are not the cause, but they make visible long-standing structural problems. Gender can be a powerful predictor of inequality and vulnerability in such structural contexts. The mere fact that this conversation occurs more in women forums than in mixed gender forums tell us who is carrying that mental burden. Not only caring for the household. In these conversations, many women mention the need to save as a way of being aware of caring of the country economy or caring of the stresses of the climate change. So the experience of vulnerability is forged from the negotiation of energy poverty in both mental and emotional burden. Mental burden comes from the household's management, task of responding and coping with budget constraints such as spatial, temporal rationing for the use of energy services, adjusting individual routines to reduce the demand for these services, and the redirection of the budget from other goods to use energy services. Emotional burden comes from the high emotional intensity that energy deprivation represents. In that is the stress we need to provide for the well-being of family members and having to distribute and manage household expenses within the available budget, which commonly leads to emotions such as fear, shame, guilt. So to final, added to this is the mental burden of immigration conditions, the pressure to adapt, the pressure of losing the Anmeldung, the pressure of losing the visa, the pressure that every cost increase implies for people in precarious jobs.
Well, thanks, Paz. I think I'm beginning to understand a little thing. Oh, okay, hello, Mina. Let me guess. There's more stories that show how my analysis is totally wrong, or what are you doing here?
Well, actually, not really, Jörg.
Oh, that's nice.
It's actually the opposite. I bring some support to your positive readings from Greece.
Thank you, finally.
Yes, from Greece. It turns out that the hugely controversial measures to contain the national debt crisis since 2010 were successful. Look at all those indices: Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, DBRS. They are all rating positively Greece the last years. Have a look also to our national statistics.
I would, if it moved. There we go.
The unemployment rate, the investments, if they appear. Also, the number of households having access to the internet. Great. Even the European Commission foresees a 2.4% development for Greece for 2023. Great, right? It seems
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying.
Things seem to go really nice. After all this period of austerity and financial crisis, people seem to look to the future positively.
Well, so
right?
they should. That's good.
Amazing. Oh, I forgot. I had also a letter from some friends. They are communicating with us their news. Would you like we read it together?
Absolutely. I think after this we can do with some good news that support my point of view. So
Okay.
Go ahead.
Let's go for that.
Go for it.
Dear Mina, we are really happy to learn that you are doing great in Berlin. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same from Greece. The food has become very expensive. The same is with the rent and the medical treatment. The percentage of children leaving early the school has increased while government, in order to save money, is closing down the public schools. We are the country within the European zone with the highest population percentage at the borderline of poverty and social exclusion. Society is really in trouble. We are experiencing an unprecedented increase of violence against women inside the home. Life expectancy has decreased. People in Greece suffer and die. And don't forget, in Greece, not only Greeks die, unfortunately. Well, it doesn't make sense. I don't really understand that, but maybe Thodoris is coming from Greece, and maybe he could help me to understand. Thodoris, what do you think about the future of people? Could you help me with that?
Γυρίζω τις πλάτες μου στο μέλλον μου φτιάχνε το πως θέλετε, αφού η ιστορία σας ανήκει, σαρώστε το λοιπόν αν επιμένετε. Στη αυτιά μου δεν χωράνε υποσχέσεις, το έργο το έχω δει, μη με τρελαίνετε, το πλοίο των ονείρων μου με πάει κόσμους που εσείς δεν τους αντέχετε. Μένω μονάχος στο παρόν μου, να σώσω οτιδήποτε αν σώζεται, κι ας έχω τις συνέπειες του νόμου, συνένοχος στο φόνο δεν θα με έχετε. Μένω μονάχος στο παρόν μου, να σώσω οτιδήποτε αν σώζεται, κι ας έχω τις συνέπειες του νόμου, συνένοχος στο φόνο δεν θα με έχετε. Γυρίζω τις πλάτες μου στο μέλλον, το κόλπο είναι στημένο και στα μέτρα σας, ξεγράψτε με απ' τα καταστιχά σας, στον κόλπο σας δεν μπαίνω και στα έργα σας. Γυρίζω τις πλάτες μου στο μέλλον που φτιάχνε το πως θέλετε, αφού η ιστορία σας ανήκει, σαρώστε το λοιπόν αν επιμένετε. Μένω μονάχος στο παρόν μου, να σώσω οτιδήποτε αν σώζεται, κι ας έχω τις συνέπειες του νόμου, συνένοχος στο φόνο δεν θα με έχετε. Μένω μονάχος στο παρόν μου, να σώσω οτιδήποτε αν σώζεται, κι ας έχω τις συνέπειες του νόμου, συνένοχος στο φόνο δεν θα με έχετε. Μένω μονάχος στο παρόν μου, να σώσω οτιδήποτε αν σώζεται, κι ας έχω τις συνέπειες του νόμου, συνένοχος στο φόνο δεν θα με έχετε.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks. It is beginning to dawn on me that I may have overestimated individuals' capacities to act and to cope. I wonder whether white male privilege has anything to do with that. Anyway, I appreciate that for a lot of people in Germany and beyond, however robust, creative or energetic they are as individuals, structural conditions are overwhelming. So maybe focusing on more cash in people's pockets is not the solution. It seems that trying to respond to multiple crises makes us aware not only of particular vulnerabilities, but of interdependence. As a general state of being, interdependence of individuals and of communities, but also interdependence of countries. But let me try and sort of rescue this lecture that slightly got out of hand, and start by returning to our son of York and how he secured current and future energy needs. I was going to show some numbers on how the future Germany energy and resource demand and how that's secured through international trade. Yes, I see you, Sascha. Secured through international trade deals, but I can see Sascha getting very nervous and also Jorge already in there. So would you like to come forward or anyway take the mic and tell us why I'm about to get my second lesson wrong? And what is problematic with using international trade deals to secure German energy future and manage our energy transitions? Please do tell me why not.
Thank you, Jörg. I will stay here. What we see is that the so-called energy transition mainly reproduce the relationship of dependency and the role of Latin American countries as suppliers of raw materials while deepening existing inequalities. Latin American countries seek to join the transition bandwagon from the north, embracing the post-extractive project, now with the promise of better wealth distribution. In this way, territories are sacrificed to promote the so-called progress, development, or modernization, highly desired. However, it is not the common people who benefit from the extractive projects beyond the promise of job opportunities. What remains in these territories are profound environmental impact, such as pollution and excessive water consumption, leading to increasing drought, water crisis, and the drying up of lagoons and wetlands. In the case of Chile, President Boric promises to promote the new national lithium policy with higher environmental standards. For example, investing money in the study of salt floods. This sounds good because we know what the cost of the so-called developments are high. But once again, it is the paradox of the left and the limits of their ecological discourse when faced with reality in a country that is increasingly dependent on foreign investment, driving extraction projects in its territory. This is what the researchers now call it post-extractivism.
I mean, we must remember that these nation states emerge as heirs of power structures born on invasion and dispossession, in this case colonial ones. And these logics of dispossession continue. They are not relics of the past. So clearly this is not limited to the relationship between the Chilean state with the population of these territories. It also continues also further from the energy issue. It happens in, for example, infrastructure construction, like in the Mexican case, in the current government's relationship with the Mayan people, in the construction of the so-called Tren Maya, the Mayan train, which is imposed by the Mexican state upon Mayan peoples. And to make matters worse, it cuts through the last remaining preserved jungle in Mexico. And this project involving Deutsche Bahn. And we are talking about Chile and Mexico, which are two democratically elected governments born out of popular and leftist movements. We are not talking about dictatorship resulting from the US interventionism. However, when it comes to making economic decisions, they are indistinguishable from any other government, whether conservative or not, as they follow the logic of capitalist and neoliberal, quote-unquote, development. And the way to discern who is entitled to rights and who is subject to persecution or surveillance is essentially racial. In this sense, for a Mapuche person, it doesn't matter who holds power in Santiago, in the capital, as the white settled colonial invader state permanent policy is to contain them and to displace them. As some decolonial critics say, these political representatives of white or mestizo white nation states are doing business over stolen land. So the same thing happens elsewhere. It's not just a Latin American problem. It occurs with the Sami people confronting oil companies in Finland, or with the First Nations facing the government of the US or Canada, just as it happens in Australia, and so on and so forth. So therefore, from a decolonial standpoint, following the teachings of the Zapatistas, we say that there may be new arrangements on the top between nation states or among new blocs or among capital or new actors or so on, but below, dispossession, predation, contamination will persist, because they are inseparable from the system as a whole. And it is more than clear that there will be no planet sufficient to meet the growing demand of raw materials required by European consumption patterns, for example. So we share with other critical sectors the urgency to change production relationships, the exploitative relationship with the earth, and the distribution of power among genders and people as a way out of the various crises. And this clearly requires much stronger actions than the current political representations of nation states or corporate actors or institutions, including universities, are willing to take in Chile, in Mexico, or Germany. Perhaps the last generation movement is willing to, but not the different establishments.
Yes, just to add a final comment, the case of the last generation is a matter of concern for those of us who have lived in this country for some time. Given the numerous failed climate conferences, where all that remains are empty promises, it is understandable that the protest of those young people genuinely concerned about sustainability, as defined in the Brundtland report, becomes radicalized. It is worrisome that this protest movement is criminalized and persecuted as terrorist in Bavaria. This could set precedents in other regions of the country. Not to mention the immigration policy of the great fortress Europe, which is becoming increasingly harsh. As Latin American members of diaspora communities, we view this with great concern, and we believe that the prospects are not very promising, given the rising popularity of right-wing populism, not only in Europe.
Please let me continue and take a seat. I think we can take it from here without your little summaries. Join me on a quick visit to Peru, where the winter of discontent was actually summer, just to decolonize your metaphor. So join me in a quick visit to Peru, where the lesson from the summer of discontent is that the people have and do keep going in face of overwhelming adversity. Excuse me, can you take the microphone? Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you. Yeah. There is no time for details here, so let me be brief. The Russian war on Ukraine arrived to Peru last year and as a fertilizer crisis that threatened domestic crop production and thus hunger crisis. Also, fed prices soared, which made chicken, a central pillar of our cuisine, very expensive. On top of that, Cyclone Yaku arrived with heavy rains and put mainly northern Peru in an acute crisis. Data from the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs shows almost 500,000 of affected people. There were nearly 150,000 affected houses, and several services collapsed, like schools and roads. As always, such a catastrophic event results from a combination of natural factors and a lack of preparedness. In this case, the government ignored early warnings, and disaster response was likely further hampered by corruption. And yet, this acute climate-related event was only a brief interruption of ongoing political upheaval. Following the coup attempt by former President Pedro Castillo, demonstrations against the new alliance between conservative parliamentarians and Castillo's Vice President Dina Boluarte, now President, resulted in a bloodbath. From December 7th, the day of the attempt, until January 23, 447 demonstrations occurred, according to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Mobilizations were massive and mainly took place in the south of Peru, a region that regularly demonstrates against the status quo. Protesters expressed their anger against the new allies under the motto, que se vayan todos, everybody out, basically. Many also defended Castillo, a peasant and rural school teacher who truly represented them. Sadly, brutal repression endorsed by criminalization of protest yielded 57 deaths, 8 youngsters and 1 policeman among them, and 912 injured. Such a tragedy exacerbated demonstrations. Boluarte's government doesn't take responsibility for this massacre and blocks attempts to proper investigations, and the parliament continues its assault to various branches of the government. This behavior fuels protests. Demonstrations are restarting, aiming for massive mobilizations and takeover of the Peruvian capital, Lima, on July the 19th. This continuation of political crisis will make an undesirable crossover with the already confirmed El Niño, whose visits start this month. We will have to find a way to literally navigate this situation as well. Anyway, anyhow, we will just keep going. The sky might fall, but we will just keep going. Ultimately, we are luchadores, which means fighters in English, but we give it like a deeper meaning, referring to those who endure difficult times because such times are always there. So there is the need to keep going no matter what. Hey, Mark.
Yeah, many people in Hungary can actually relate to keep going no matter what. Hungary experienced very high inflation prices during the winter. During my visit over Christmas, I found out actually that many basic products like food are similarly priced or even more expensive than here in Germany. This is a big issue there because salaries there are much lower. We are talking about 30–50% of the German salaries in the middle class. This is somewhat mitigated there by fixing the prices of a handful of basic products like milk or flour, which you can think about. It's a very controversial economic decision from the government. Fuel prices were also fixed over more than a year, but this ended this spring. And a bigger issue, there were very strong subsidies for household gas prices over more than a decade. But this had to be ended in last fall. This made living costs much, much higher. For the last decade, the gas prices were so low that there was basically no incentive to upgrade the heating systems or insulations for any savings in private households. On top of this, Hungary just recently started to experience real climate-related issues. Dust storms for the first time due to severe droughts hit the country, which impacted strongly the traffic and the road infrastructure. So what's the government's response to these climate and energy entanglements? Well, for a hybrid autocracy such as Hungary, Russia still today remains a very important ally. So infrastructure development is turning towards a new nuclear power plant with the Russian Power Plant Agency, and investment of more and more new gas-powered power plants, which will be run on cheap gas imports from Russia and considered as the engine for any future industrial developments in the country. The introduction of renewable energy is actually made more difficult now, and basically the only green investments in sight are battery factories, but they are also meant to run on cheap gas. Most worryingly, perhaps, the state media supports this political course with very strong anti-Western narratives that reach large parts of the population. So talking about decolonizing Europe's resource strategies is important, but Europe is also deeply divided when it comes to fundamental questions of statehood, infrastructure development, and geopolitics. Can you help us make sense out of this mess, Jelena?
Well, I can't really help you make sense of this mess, but I can add a perspective. Let me report from China, just one example amongst the many places in which the issues touched upon already unfold along their own timelines, but with ramifications across the world. As one of the most powerful nation states, when China acts, it can have far-reaching consequences, not only for its own population within its borders, but for us all globally. One need only think about greenhouse gas emissions. We've all heard that China is the largest CO2 emitter, if not per capita, than in total terms. In turn, the trajectory of global climate change is shaped by decisions China makes around its energy transition. But energy politics is just one example of many consequential, concurrent developments in which China acts on its own terms and timelines that have ripple effects across the world. This winter was a case in point. while we here had mostly moved into a post-COVID mode and reshuffled our concerns around other ongoing crises, such as the Russian war in Ukraine or inflation, people in China continued living in a bubble of zero-COVID policies. This bubble was popped by the contagiousness of Omicron, but also public frustration and eventually a sudden shift and lift of all COVID restrictions within mere days. So, what is post-COVID life like in China? From what friends have shared, there's much relief that rolling lockdowns are a thing of the past and that they and almost everybody around them got through their first round of infections quickly. But there's also the eerie specter of a death toll unreported by authorities and therefore unknown, as well as the lingering sense that the normal that people have gone back to is in fact a new normal. Internationally, supply chains had been rattled, in no small parts by the disruptions of China's long lockdowns. Then, the party state made this decision to end zero COVID without any explanation, neither to its own population, let alone to us. Like many other deeply consequential decisions it makes, the party state does not seek to involve us, nor does it depend on our approval. China's continuing and pivotal impact on global emissions and images like these that came at the end of the winter should all remind us that de-risking of the climate or many other crises is not a national endeavor. What happens over there, beyond national and political borders, is often out of sight and often out of control. But it is nevertheless an inextricable part of what comes to matter here. But then again, here is a term that depends a lot on perspective. Hi, Hyunjin. So, which here are you reporting from?
My here is certainly there and out of sight, viewed from this here in Europe. My here is South Korea. Yep. How many of you know that South Korea is among the top 10 global greenhouse gas emitting countries? We had a harsh winter that revealed multiple problems of our energy system. We import over 90% of our energy from other countries. Electricity and gas prices are approved by the government, and this has been a highly politicized subject. The past and current governments have been reluctant to increase energy prices, and the chronically low energy prices have discouraged people to invest in energy efficiency. And when the government really had to raise the price, it was a shock to many vulnerable households. And interestingly, during the winter, the major news outlets tried to frame the triggers of the energy crisis in Europe around two things. One is too much dependence on Russian gas, and secondly, too much dependence on the renewable energies. In the current energy supply and demand plan, where the Korean government present the energy target mix for 2030, the nuclear energy target was increased, and whereas renewable energy was decreased by the same amount. So the current government claims that the past government set unrealistic and too ambitious renewable energy targets. And instead, nowadays, nuclear energy is equated with secure energy, and all plants' lifetimes will be extended. As a country with a suspended war and where a long shoreline with the Sea of East Sea, where the contaminated water from Fukushima will soon be released, are we learning from the past, and do we have enough discussions on this matter? Or is the winter of discontent being used to push forward the nuclear agenda to serve the interests of incumbent actors? But it is all not bad news. There are also positive developments. In Korea, currently only 10% of our energy comes from renewables. Over 80% of the population resides in cities. The so-called energy transition towns in the capital city Seoul produce renewable energies, with solar panels installed in apartments, schools, and public buildings. The cooperatives consult households and small shops on how they can use energy in an efficient way and educate students on energy-related subjects. Through a collaboration with the local banks, households can get a loan for the installation of solar panels. These are still very small movements, but the recent energy crisis has been an impetus to replicate the transition towns.
So let's stay in the Pacific and with the energy question, but switch back to the Southern Hemisphere. So in Australia, it was a summer of rising costs of living, but also tentative hope that political conditions for progressive environmental and social agendas could in fact improve. Here's just one initiative in which a community project in New South Wales tries to electrify their neighborhood with the goal to generate political support for further pilots and eventually broader policymaking. They've shown that already available technology can achieve, and that we need not only pin our hopes on far-off technological breakthroughs. They've also shown how small political actions might be scaled up to the neighborhood and district level and maybe even beyond. Importantly, from the very beginning, they included the dimension of social justice through advocating for funding strategies that would enable less affluent communities to also take part. That, in turn, envisions what more inclusive and widespread electrification could look like. Meanwhile, 3,000-something kilometers northeast of the coast of Australia, in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, is Desiree.
So Oceania's islands, and those are the islands in the South Pacific, are often referred to in the media as the untergehenden Inseln, the sinking islands or the islands that are drowning. And apart from the fact that islands actually do not sink, but are submerged, many Oceania stakeholders resist this stigma. And the Pacific climate warriors, for example, are trying to reverse the narrative of sinking islands, working under the slogan, "We are not drowning, we are fighting." Islands are not isolated from global events, and the island-to-island links and cooperation between Pacific island states form a political sea of islands, to quote Apeli Ha'ova, a famous indigenous anthropologist, which together could be a good partner for Europe. And in the end, no one can be an island. Individuals must work together. Vanuatu in the South Pacific is one of those countries for which the fight against climate change also means networking and working together. And last November, the international community met in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt for COP27. And in the German pavilion, Annalena Baerbock and Ralf Regenvano, the Minister for Climate Change in Vanuatu, sat side by side on the podium. Vanuatu, one of the countries with the lowest emissions, yet highly vulnerable to environmental events, has been on the move for years, both domestically and in international forums. And Ralf Regenvano has long stressed that Vanuatu wants to move towards a sustainable economy and way of life, and that adaptation to climate change is a top priority. But without joint work with industrialized countries, no success can be achieved. And this unprecedented public meeting at the COP, Annalena Baerbock brought Germany's important role and responsibility to the discussion on loss and damage from the economic burden of climate change. And Regenvano once again stressed the need for cooperation to avoid the cumulative effects of multiple crises. And I quote him, "International law is the guardrail we have established ourselves to ensure we cooperate for the good of humanity and for the good of our own sustainable development." And after a productive summer, and of course our winter here is the summer in the Southern Hemisphere, things have progressed in March 2023, and Vanuatu successfully led a coalition of 132 nations to adopt by consensus a UN General Assembly resolution requesting a non-binding advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice to provide clarity on how existing international laws can be applied to strengthen action on climate change, protect people and the environment, and save the Paris Agreement. Discussions on loss and damage and international law should not be seen as a form of punishment for us, but as a sign of global solidarity. And for people on islands, being on their own is not an option. Islands are connected to the sea and to the mainland. And this is true for the South Pacific as well as for North America. And our colleague Pauline Münch, who is sitting over there, collected some stories from people living on an island in Canada where lives and environments have been and are in consistent transformation and thus really dynamic. And let's come back, and speaking of global solidarity, coming back to the wider European continent and something that shapes our life those days. There's field report coming in via Dagmar Hase, one of our colleagues, and she got this field report from geography colleagues in Ukraine. There's also a case of hope, if you can put it that way, that the people in the towns and villages of the attacked Ukraine, instead of everyone fleeing and ducking away, are building networks of mutual aid with the help of social media in a very short time. To withstand the war and, what is even more impressive, taking the terrible destruction of entire settlements as a bitter opportunity to rebuild cities like Kharkiv or Kherson, but also smaller places such as Izium, as sustainable settlements in a climate-friendly manner. And this is actually a powerful form of resilience and quite a counterpoint to the concern and fear in the West. So, what do we take away from this global observatory running through the whole winter? And here are some thoughts we had, and of course this is still food for thought. And here are our 5 lessons. First, singular master narratives of global transformation are not adequately depicting the enormous diversity of how people, communities, and nation-states deal with the challenges of planetary change. Second, for the great majority of people worldwide, climate change is already very real, and it is always deeply entangled with the complexities of everyday lives and political formations, and therefore with questions of democracy and justice. Third, the affluent Western European reading of this global moment as consisting of multiple crises is ignoring the fact that for many people worldwide, this is not multiple crises relative to a normal, and that was before. It is, and it has been, the normal state of affairs for those at the margins of late modern capitalism for a long time. Social and ecological precarity, asymmetrical relations, and exploitation of nature as resource. Fourth, major technological breakthroughs are not in sight anywhere. Narratives of technological salvations are thus more hubris than anything else. If technology does play a role, it is existing technologies that are being employed when people start to work together for a common goal. And these are humble technologies. And last, people worldwide are trying to make a difference by responding to planetary change. We here in Germany need to find the courage to believe that a good life in Germany is not really tied to the stereotypes of sausages, terraced housing, or cars, not tied to the unfettered consumption. And we need to accept and respect that we, as a global we, are facing planetary changes together as a common cosmopolitical project.
Στο ίδιο έργο θεατές, χαμένης νύχτας εραστές, με μια κιθάρα της Αθήνας στον εξωστή. Από το σήμερα στο χθες, της απουσίας φοιτητές, με έναν ήχο στη ψυχή να βαγοσώστη. Ό,τι ακούω να ακούς, μέσα σε κόσμους μυστικούς, θα ανακαλύψεις μια πατρίδα ξεχασμένη, παραδομένη στους καιρούς και σε πελάτες πονηρούς και σε πληγάδες μια ζωή παγιδευμένη. Εσύ και εγώ τραγουδιστές, φανατικοί της πιο μεγάλης εξουσίας. Ήχοι μας διαδηλωτές και τα στιχάκια εμπριστές, αυτό το έργο είναι παιχνίδι φαντασίας. Σενάριο χωρίς πλοκή, της ιστορίας εμπλοκή, αυτά τα χρόνια που χρεώθηκες να ζήσεις. Με ποια τραγούδια να σωθείς, με ποιους δικούς σου να βρεθείς, και ποιαν αλήθεια τώρα πια να μαρτυρήσεις. Θα βρούμε αλλιώτικους ρυθμούς του τραγουδιού μας τους γκρεμούς, θα περπατήσουμε κι απόψε ακροβατές. Αλόγια και λιγμούς της εποχής μας τους στιγμούς, θα σε χωρίσουμε απ' τις οφθαλμαπάτες. Στο ίδιο έργο θεατές, εσύ κι εγώ τραγουδιστές, ή της πιο μεγάλης εξουσίας. Ήχοι μας διαδηλωτές και τα στιχάκια εμπριστές, αυτό το έργο είναι παιχνίδι φαντασίας. Στο ίδιο πάντα σκηνικό και στις ψυχής το πανικό, απόψε πνίγομαι, χρειάζομαι αέρα. Θέλω να αρχίσω από εδώ, αλλιώς τα πράγματα να δω, να πω στον κόσμο μια δικιά μου καλησπέρα. Στο ίδιο έργο θεατές, εσύ κι εγώ τραγουδιστές, φανατικοί της πιο μεγάλης εξουσίας.
Vielen Dank.
Yes, please, everyone coming to the front. To be continued.
That's it. It leaves us not really in the mood for discussions. I think everything's been said and everything's been heard. But if there are questions, and if there is a need to discuss, there would be time to do that. As people disperse back to their seats, I think I'm allowed to field questions, if not the answers.
Well, actually, since they are Greek songs, and probably it was the first time that you were exposed to them, at least to say that the first song has to do with the difficulty that somebody is facing to look to the future, because somebody else is forming the future for him, so he prefers to stay his present instead of looking to the future and try to cope with whatever he can do in order to survive. And the second song actually says that we are all audience to the same theatrical play, let's say. And in the end, the poet concludes by saying that actually I have my own way to say good evening or good morning, if you want, to his audience, to the people. So even IRI THESys has its own way to say the things from its own very special perspective. And that's why I thought these songs were quite relevant to today's lecture. And I really want to thank Thodoris from heart. And yeah, if he has another song, it's a will. Thodoris is always...
Doesn't have to be strictly relevant to global change, I'm sure. No, you don't have to. You don't have to. We don't want to force you.
I don't know. One, you want, whatever. Choose one for the exam. No.
The audience wins. No one wants to discuss.
Vielen Dank. We have tried, but...
Sorry, I just wanted to add that, we were talking about the questions at the beginning, or at the end of the lecture, but if you also want to add one story, something, you've seen how the presentation went on, so if you want to add something, you can also, you are welcome to do it.
I've never seen so many people wanting to get out of a very warm room so desperately. But still. You all happy? Actually, I have no idea how the end to this is planned. Are we just dissipating? I'm looking desperately for Axel. There's Axel. There's no... We're just possibly going for a drink somewhere, but those who are not involved with that is... Yes. Okay, people are showing thumbs up. Yes. Well, I can see that you've... Yes. Pauline. Yes. Oh, God. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to talk tonight.
Well, I'm just curious of your process in starting this and seeing it now to the end. How it's been for you since the first, the brainchild, and how it's come to be now on screen and with the music and with the stories. Yeah, I'm just curious of that.
That's been stressful. No, it's been a fun process. It didn't go as planned. Well, there wasn't much of a plan, and that even didn't work, which was largely my fault, so I apologize for that. But then people just brought materials, and a story started to emerge, and people knew people who could sing fantastically well. So music entered this, and it became a bit of a choreography, and I think it was pretty much, I guess as a social scientist I ought to say, it was a bottom-up or grounded process with a story that emerged. And yeah, as the pressure grew, having to perform, so grew the commitment, and so the narrative formed, I would say. So it's been exciting. I'm very glad that it worked so well. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been fantastic. So yeah, there's another question at the back.
Just as a follow-up, what's the continuation of this project now? What's going to happen with it? And also, just as feedback, this was a really cool presentation. As a natural scientist, they're usually a bit more dry, so this was really, really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take that with you. More singing at natural science conferences. That can't do any harm. Yes, well, we don't know yet, is the short answer. I probably won't be continuing, sadly, with this group because I'm moving on to other places. But I think, as a basic idea, it worked. It was, it produced a kind of a bricolage or a collage of things. So if people do find the energy to follow up and develop formats and keep observing things that happen in a kind of planetary context and start piecing things together, I'm certainly up for the discussion. Maybe not tonight, but once people have recovered, it might do. But there's no plan as such or large funding application in line or major sort of science publication, but who knows?
If you have an idea, we are open to it.
Hello. First of all, thank you for everyone that has brought this to life. I thought it was a very engaging presentation. The music was great. And my question actually is, what project this is, how it came to be, because I came here because I saw advertisements for the lecture and it sounded very interesting, and I am not at all disappointed. I just want some more context on, how this came to be.
Well, there's not much more than you saw. Do you want to answer?
Yeah, maybe I can say something to this because I have been collecting in this online diary for 3 years now. The idea of the logbook of change was to document changes in daily life, because this is what we as sustainability scientists, it's also the glass ceiling we hit, because daily life seems so hard to change. So we thought the times of crisis, daily life has to change, and it's a possibility to understand how it is changeable, or where it has its limits, and where it is frustrating, where it is too much asked for. So this was our scientific interest in the logbook of change, and we had conversations at IRI THESys, and I think as this is a great place for exchanging among each other, and picking up ideas that emerge on the floors, although we had a little bit of a hard time because our floors are not there anymore, it still worked. So it was really an emerging process to not have this logbook, but add observations from other places. And I think also for me it's very interesting to see my own research in the full picture. I think that's what I can probably say for everyone, that yeah, we gain from this joint perspective we can create at IRI THESys, because we are so many and have so many different views and perspectives in our research, and that this integrative approach is something that we need for research on transformations of human environment systems. Other questions?
I think we go for a drink.
Cold beer?
Thank you all very, very much for coming out tonight. Thank you to the observers. This was absolutely fantastic. Thanks from my side to all of IRI THESys. This is unfortunately my last sort of active contribution in this wonderful run I had with you. I really enjoyed that. I'll be moving on, so I'm a little sad tonight, but it's been wonderful having you here. Thanks for this last crazy format. Keep doing that. Keep pondering what your contribution is to the planetary footprint. Have a safe journey home. See some of you tomorrow, and see the rest of you
and thank you so
sometime
much,
around. Thank you.
Thank you.